Okay, so for next time, right, you're going to be writing the final reflection paper. I want to talk a little bit about those before we really get into the material for today, because I think some of you are still a little bit confused about what to do. So, this is the last of these you're going to be doing before you start on the big paper. So if we can kind of get this straightened out, then we'll all be in better shape. I also want you to read the chapter in Writing Analytically on Claims and Evidence, chapter 6 for next time. Claim and evidence is going to be really, really important for actually getting that first big paper right? So I really want to pay close attention to this stuff. And we're going to be doing an exercise that's going to involve you using a paper from another class, right? So as I've said to those of you who asked about it, if you don't have a paper that you're working on for another class right now, if you have a paper that you've already submitted for another class, that's fine. Or if you have a paper from high school that you can bring, that is also acceptable.
Could I bring a paper from, because I'm transferred here, so could I bring a paper from like a common class?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Just so long as it's not something that you're working on for this class right now, right? Yeah, it's just got to be something from a different class, that's all. So does anybody have any questions about anything before I get started? Okay, so just a couple of quick things that I'm noticing across the board on the reflection papers. Most of you did seem to grasp from last time that the context is something you should be applying later on, right? You analyze the language first, then you analyze the context, right? So that's good. That's a positive step. The problem is some of you were giving me context and then not relating them at all to the language that you quoted, right? It's like, this is the context in which this thing was written, but you weren't really trying to explain how it was connected to your quote, right? So one thing to always keep in mind, and we'll work on this a lot more when we start talking about claim and evidence, right, is that your instructors are by and large not mind readers, right? So we do need to have spelled out for us what you see the connections as. So if you think that this illuminates the quote in some way, you need to explain why, right? And then that's, then once you can do that, right, then you're golden and you've got this down. The other thing that I was noticing is that many of you were treating this as a kind of agree-disagree assignment, right? I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with the essay that you're reading. What I am asking you to do is analyze some feature of the language that you think is somehow interesting or revealing, right? So to give you an example, just like the kinds of things that we've talked about in class here. Like, for example, when we read the Rachel Carson essay. The Rachel Carson essay is, at least on its surface, not about war, right? But there's all that war-related language in it, right? So the thing that I'm asking you to do is to find one of those kinds of things, right? Like something that doesn't, like some kind of quirk of language or some kind of pattern of language that doesn't seem to be directly related to the argument of the essay, and figure out what it's doing there, right? So yeah, the way we talked about war language in Rachel Carson, the way we talked about this kind of language of family in the Tacitus piece, right? These are the kinds of things I want y'all looking for and trying to analyze, right? Not the agree-disagree thing. And one more thing, I don't think anybody who is here did this, but if the only piece of text that you're quoting from the reading is from the editor's introduction, you're pretty much telling me that you didn't do the reading, right? So don't do that, right? Make sure that the quote you choose is from the actual text itself, right? Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this?
Just like future reference, if you don't need the word count, do you get a grade?
You will not get a passing grade if you don't need the word count, but you will get a grade. So you might get a D. depending on by how much you miss it, right?
I was just curious. I mean, she did not hear this. She was like, I have a 0. But,
Well, I can't discuss
Yeah.
another student's grades. So, any other questions about this? Okay, then here's how I want to start thinking about the Martha Nussbaum essay that y'all read for today. I want us to try to interrogate and analyze the key terms in the title first, right? And then see how those are being applied throughout the essay. So the first thing I want you to do is take 5 minutes and I want you to do a free write, right? Explain to me what education for profit means. Right. Emphasize these two words here. Like, what is education? What is profit? And how can these two be connected? Right. minutes?
Oh,
2 minutes.
oh.
Okay, time's up. All right, so let's just go across the row here and read what you wrote. So Hannah, do you mind starting?
Can I go last?
Everybody's going to have to, so it's...
Well, I didn't really understand what she was talking about, like in this. I don't really pull out that much out of it, so I don't really know.
Okay, what do you think education for profit means?
I mean, just like common sense wise, like if people are educated, then it profits everybody because it like
Okay.
makes them smarter, therefore can do more things, I guess.
Okay, so you're thinking of profit as any kind of positive good here. Okay, go ahead.
I kind of did the same thing she did, but
Uh-huh.
I kind of went like more into like, because Martha kind of went more into detail in the last how she
Uh-huh.
did the profit.
Okay, what did you write? Can you just read that for us?
I said, I think education for profit can mean multitude of things.
Uh-huh.
However, there's a positive and negative side
Okay.
of profit. Most people take the positive side, but more people can take the negative side just depending on who you are. And then I also included that she goes into great detail about, briefly explains how to benefit one another once you included this in.
Okay, just that last bit again.
She went in more into detail
Uh-huh.
about how, like, the economic growth and, like, basic needs for, like, a multitude of things could benefit you.
Okay. So yeah, so I think what Nussbaum is doing, and I think is connecting the idea of education for profit, right, to education for economic growth, right? So she actually has a specific definition of profit in mind when she talks about profit. Okay. Good. Good. Renderi, what did you write?
I put, in my opinion, the phrase education for profit means that the more education that you have, the more money you need, or better
Okay.
opportunities that you have.
Okay. So you are also connecting it here specifically to education for economic purposes, right? Education for, connected to making more money. All right, good. Carmen.
Education for profit is basically using knowledge for people to make money or benefit oneself. Education is knowledge given to someone to help push them to what their goals will become in life. The profit is something gained in the aftermath of the distribution, usually money. Education for profit is looking to learn knowledge given to someone to make a gain money for someone else.
Okay, good. So yeah, you've essentially taken, the kind of exact literal task I gave her, like interrogate both of these terms, right? And that is exactly what you did. Said, okay, what does education mean? What does profit mean? And then how do I link these two up, right? All right, good. Shelby, what did you write?
So I think education for profit means that if you get a good education, you'll be able to get something in return, whether it's money or a good job.
Okay. So, and I think where I'm seeing most of you say more or less the same here is that education for profit is education in order to get something, right? At the end of it, you are rewarded in some way, probably financially. So, I'd like you to take another 5 minutes and think about the other half of the title now, right? And, if you want to bring in how you think Nussbaum defines it, that's great, but I'm more interested really in what you think these terms mean right now and what you think they're doing. So I'm going to take another 5 minutes. And I apologize for how crappy the marker's coming out here. I just cleaned this board, and sometimes when you clean it, it takes a little while to dry. And I want you to write on the following question, right? What does education for democracy? Right, what does it mean to be educated for democracy?
It's like a definition of democracy.
What's that?
Like democracy. Like what is it?
Well, figure it out. What do you think it is? 2 minutes. Okay, time's up. So let's start in the middle this time. Mary, would you mind starting us off? And just make sure you speak loudly because there's that thing going and I don't hear very well. So.
Okay. I put that education for democracy means that the more knowledge that you have, I guess the more diverse your point of view is.
Okay.
Education is a process used to, I guess, used by an individual to obtain knowledge, and a democracy is like everybody has their own voice and their own opinion about different things.
Okay.
There's government initiatives you have.
Okay.
So the more education you have, the more favorable your voice is when it comes down to making different decisions.
Okay. And I think the whole diversity thing, we might also be able to connect to the Rachel Carson incident, right? Now, one of her big things is that nature prefers diversity, whereas human beings tend to prefer creating these kind of monocultures, right? But I think you're also got, I think, pointing to an interesting thing there about how education makes you a more effective participant in democracy, right? When everybody has a different opinion about something, what do you need to be able to do effectively in order to make good decisions? Pardon?
I would say provide evidence to back up.
Yeah, you need to be, for one thing, you need to be able to provide evidence to back up what it is you're saying, right? But even if you're just choosing among alternatives others are proposing, right? What do you need to be able to do? Yeah, I mean, keeping an open mind is good, right? But you've also got to be able to weigh different options, right? And see which one is best. And yeah, I think that that's kind of like where what you're saying there is moving towards, right? The kind of idea of democracy. All right, good. Shelby, what did you write?
I couldn't think about what democracy is. So I've heard people say like we live in a democracy. So
Okay.
I tried to like pull from that so I
Okay.
can figure out what it was. But I think it's, I said it's how our government educates us.
Okay.
I don't really know what democracy is, so it's probably wrong.
Okay, so maybe why don't we back up there and think a little bit about what democracy means and what it means to live in a democracy, right? Because I mean, like, you're not wrong to be confused, right? It is a kind of confusing idea sometimes. So what does it mean, y'all think, to live in a democracy? What is a democracy?
Everyone can have their own voice, like freedom.
Rights.
Okay,
Freedom.
okay, yes, freedom of speech, value of human rights. Yeah, what were you saying, Carmen?
I said equality.
Equality, okay, yeah, these are all things that we think of as associated with democracy, right? But what literally is a democracy?
Like a group of people together to enforce rules and stuff.
Yeah, it's a type of government, right? Yeah, and anytime you see this, crassy at the end of a word, right? Comes from a Greek root, kratos, which means government. So, for example, if you live in a theocracy, who rules in a theocracy? Theos is the Greek word for God.
Like a king, like
Usually, like priests or religious figures in a theocracy are the leaders, right? If you are living in this is a negative term that sometimes, like a kleptocracy is a corrupt government, right? Klepto, ruled by thieves. Demos, in Greek, means people. So democracy then means literally what?
The people who are church.
Yes. Good, Carmen. Yes, government by the people, right?
like we people.
Exactly, yeah. We the people of these United States in order to form a more perfect union, blah, 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 right? Yeah, so the basic principle of a democracy is that the people rule, right? And so we can think about these different kinds of education. Education for personal profit benefits you, right? And I think that what Nussbaum is talking about when she talks about education for democracy is preparing people to be active participants in their own government, right? Which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with financial reward. So I think that's kind of what's at stake here, right? What are the, who hasn't spoken yet? Okay, Meredith, go ahead, and then Hannah. I just want to make sure we give everybody a
I
chance.
definitely did not go that much into detail.
Okay.
Because I didn't really get it, to be completely honest.
Okay.
I said if you find like education that's like good or like stable, but like having people to as your government isn't really like stable, in my opinion. It's like
Okay.
everything can change. Like I'm not saying that like our government now can't change.
Sure.
But like it has to go through so many steps. Like it has to go through the judicial branch, like the executive, legislative, and stuff.
Right.
So I just said it's kind of like your human rights. I said like how she's human rights as an example.
Okay. Yeah, and I think human rights are actually a big part of what her argument is that an education for democracy is one that teaches you to respect difference of opinion and human rights. Yeah, Hannah, what did you write?
I said, education in this sense, meaning knowledge and the giving and or receiving of knowledge to further benefit a person would be their education. Therefore, education for democracy is giving/receiving this knowledge for the betterment of society, growing everyone's individual knowledge, and the gain that people receive from this education will go towards the growth and betterment of their democracy, so everyone can individually stand up for themselves and using their knowledge advance our country.
Okay. So you're trying to balance here individualism and group identity, group identification. Okay. All right, so let's try to dig into the Nussbaum essay a little bit. We may come back and do another quick free write on some of this as we work through some of these ideas. But let's see how far we can get with this. So let's turn to page 48 here. So, can I get a volunteer to read for us the first thing that she quotes at the beginning of the essay, the preamble from the Constitution of the United States? Yeah, go ahead.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Okay, thank you. So, what words jump out at you here? What seem to be the important key words in this passage?
Justice.
Justice, okay, good.
Domestic tranquility.
Yeah, we got justice, tranquility. Good, what else?
Posterity.
Posterity. Yeah, what does posterity mean?
I looked this up because I forgot.
Okay, so the word jumps out at you because you forgot what it means.
It sounds like prosperity.
It sounds like prosperity, but it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Posterity means future generations. So when we're talking about posterity, right? We're not talking about ourselves in our immediate context. We're talking about those who are going to come after us, right? Good. Anything else that sticks out at you here?
Liberty.
Okay, liberty. Okay, yeah. It's capitalized, right?
Yeah.
Constitution.
Constitution. We established this Constitution for the United States of America.
Blessings, maybe? Like
Okay.
all of it is blessings.
Okay, the blessings, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, right? So we're securing the blessings of liberty for a group, right? Not just for ourselves, but for those who are going to come in the future. And I think I just like to point you to these words as well, to, union, the idea of a more perfect union. And the idea of promoting a general welfare and providing for common defense. What do these three things have in common? General welfare, more perfect union, common defense. We could probably connect posterity to this as well.
Everyone's like united.
Yeah, we're talking about here what's good for a group, right? Not what's good for an individual. So yeah, there's a group identity established here, right? All right, now let's turn our attention to the much more recent preamble from the Constitution of India, right? So the U.S. Constitution of 1787, the Indian Constitution is from 1949. Can I get somebody to read that for us? And I want y'all, as we're reading, to think about ways in which this is, like ideas here that are connected to what we just pulled out of the U.S. Constitution, right? So anybody who wants to start, just go ahead and start reading.
We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to secure to all its citizens justice, economic and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all greater
Fraternity. Brother.
fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly of this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution.
Okay, good. So what do we pull out of this? Where do we see similarities to the U.S. Constitution?
Expression, belief, faith.
Okay.
They're both talking about like having freedom to basically say and do what you want, I guess.
Okay, yeah, there's a concern with liberty in both, right? Which spells out the liberties more specifically?
The Indian one.
Yeah, the Indian Constitution actually spells out specifically which liberties are being protected here, right? Now, the U.S. Constitution does this in the Bill of Rights, right, which is a later addendum to the original document. But yeah, in the Indian Constitution, they're doing this right in the preamble, right? And with this liberty, we see enshrined here our respect for diversity, right? Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, right? Because, like the United States, right, India is not culturally or religiously monolithic, right? You have a majority Hindu population, but you also have a large Muslim minority. You have Buddhists and Jains and Christians and other minority groups living in India, right? And the idea here is to respect everybody's religious differences. All right, good. What else do we see here? Equality, okay.
Or so like comparing the two, like how they're the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, yeah, equality here, like, is specifically spelled out as a value, right? Is equality specifically spelled out as a value in the U.S. Constitution? No. We do talk about common defense and general welfare, right? But there's no specific mention of equality.
And then, like, the Indian one, they say, like, dignity of the individual and, like, unity of everybody, so it's, like, points out the individual to
Okay.
United
Yeah.
States, but doesn't really.
And connecting the individual to the group, right?
Yeah.
This idea of, fraternity, brotherhood. So, right, so the individual does have responsibilities to the group, but also has personal individual dignity, right? And should be respected. Okay. So, why do you think Nussbaum is quoting at the beginning of her essay on education and its purposes from these two documents that don't explicitly mention education, at least not in these passages? What's she establishing about these two countries? Okay, they are both democracies, right?
Basically,
They have-
like what people have to look forward to, but what they have,
Yeah,
like
keep going.
the rules that they have to abide by.
Yeah, I mean, what we've got in both the Constitution is basically it's a legal framework and a statement of values, right? It's like these are the values around which we want to organize our society. And we've got similar sets of values in both, right? They're also similar in that, in both cases we're dealing with a multicultural democracy, right? So, a lot of what's going on here in the essay, right, is measuring up how educational practices in the U.S. and India actually meet the values set forth in their founding documents, right? And how do you think Nussbaum rates our actual adherence to these values in education in either the U.S. or India? Not especially, right? That something seems to have gone off the rails somewhere, right? So let's try to dig into the essay itself a little bit and see where she thinks things went wrong. So, can I get somebody to read this first paragraph for us? To think about education for democratic citizenship.
To think about citizenship, we have to think about what democratic nations are and what they strive for. What does it mean for a nation to advance? In one view, it means to increase its gross national product per capita. This measure of national achievement has for decades been the standard form used by development economists around the world, as if it were a good proxy for a nation's weight on the quality of life.
Okay, so gross national product, what is that? Do we know? Has anyone taken economics or covered this in like a civics class or something like that?
Is that the same thing as like gross domestic product? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, that's on our.
Yeah, GNP, GDP are basically the same thing, right? So you remember hearing the term before, you just don't remember what it means. Okay. So gross national product or gross domestic product is kind of like the aggregate of all the yearly economic outputs of a country, right? So yeah, like the total amount by which the country grows its economy in a year. So it's usually expressed, like at least in the US, or in a dollar figure, right? So this is the amount of economic output we had this year. Now, let's look at this last sentence here, right? This measure of national achievement has for decades been the standard one used by development economists around the world as if it were a good proxy for a nation's overall quality of life. So what does the way this is phrased suggest about what Nussbaum thinks about this as a measure of quality of life?
Well, it's not stable.
Yeah, that it's not a good one, right? You know, the as if suggests skepticism here, right? That people treat this like it's a good measure of overall quality of life, but it's not, right? Okay, so can I get somebody to continue for us, starting with the goal of a nation, says this model of development.
The goal of a nation says this model of development should be economic growth. Never mind about distribution and social equality. Never mind about the preconditions of a stable democracy. Never mind about the quality of race and gender relations. Never mind about the improvement of other aspects of human beings' quality of life that are not well linked to economic growth. Empirical studies have by now shown that political liberty, health, and education are all poorly correlated with growth. One side of this model leaves out is the fact that South Africa under
Apartheid.
what is that?
We'll talk about what that means.
Okay. Used to shoot to the top of the development indices.
Indices, yeah, plural of index. Yep.
There was a lot of wealth in this old South Africa, and the old model of development rewarded that achievement or good fortune, ignoring the staggering distributional inequalities, the brutal, whatever that is, regime, and the health and educational deficiencies that went with it.
Okay, so because this is going to be a sticking point, does anybody know what apartheid was?
I looked it up.
Something to do with like slaves and stuff. Like I don't know. I know it's like
Yes,
old
because they were
time.
like, it was like, oh my gosh.
I
I
can't
can
tell
see
you
the
exactly.
definition,
Okay.
like they might have, but I can't read it to you.
Yeah, so apartheid as a system in South Africa, from I think about the 30s, I think was when it was instituted, into the 1990s, was very similar to the Jim Crow laws. Right? It was a similar kind of system. It was a system of rigid segregation based on race. Right? So, so rigid that people of different races weren't allowed to live in the same areas. Indeed, like people of non-white racial classifications usually needed special passes in order to travel anywhere, even to go to work, right? So there were basically four classifications. Whites were at the top, but were also the smallest group. You had people of mixed race below them. Asians, mostly South Asians in the third group. And then the fourth group was made up of indigenous Africans. And they were the ones who had the least freedom and the fewest privileges, right? So what Nussbaum is pointing out here is that this particular system, right, which did not respect human dignity and had no respect for equality or distribution of resources, right, was still capable of producing enormous economic gains. So what is she trying to point out about measuring development in terms of economic growth by using apartheid South Africa as an example?
Is it to show like how far like we've carried this like that whole?
Well, I mean, apartheid was abolished in the early 1990s, so I remember when it happened, and I'm not that old, right? So it's, like, this is something that happened within living memory, like not that long ago. But if a system of brutal race-based repression can still produce huge economic gains, then is gross national product and growth of the economy a good measure of overall quality of life in a society? No, right? Because all it's giving you is that big number of how much the country is producing, right? But it's not telling you anything else, right? It's not giving you any other information. And if we look at the rest of the paragraph here, right, how can we tell what sorts of things Nussbaum thinks we actually ought to be focusing on in measuring quality of life? If we go back to the beginning of the paragraph. The goal of a nation, says this model of development, should be economic growth. Never mind about distribution and social equality. Never mind about the preconditions of stable democracy. Never mind about the quality of race and gender relations. Never mind about the improvement of other aspects of a human being's quality of life that are not well linked to economic growth. What do those never minds tell us?
That doesn't matter.
Yeah, that with the development model, that doesn't matter, right? But does she think that should matter? Absolutely, right? So this is where she's telling us, right? This is what the development economists think, right? This is what they think matters. This is what I think matters, right? And Nussbaum is, on the one hand, she is a humanities scholar, but she's also a lawyer. And so a lot of her interest is in how the law shapes human life and how human interests shape law, right? So we've got our first, quoted example is from, the U.S. Constitution in the late 18th century. Not even showing up, so I'm not even sure why I'm bothering writing except to amuse myself. But so, bless you. So there are 18th century theories of moral and ethical development that inform both the U.S. Constitution and a lot of what Nussbaum is arguing here, right? A Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume wrote a treatise on the relationship between moral development and our ability to sympathize with other people, right? That sympathy, Hume argued, is the basis of morality. So to give you an example of this, right? Say, I want to get out of this breezeway and Carmen is in my way, right? What would be the fastest and easiest way for me to get out of the breezeway? Yeah, just shove you out of the way, right? Well, why don't I do that? Okay, because it's rude, right? But how do I know that it's rude or that it's wrong?
Because we were raised to believe that it was morally wrong.
Nurture might be part of it, right? But according to Hume's theory of sympathy, right, I don't push her out of the way because I know that if she did it to me, it would hurt and it would be embarrassing, right? So because I can imagine how she would feel, I avoid doing her harm. So for Hume and for a lot of other 18th century thinkers, our moral sense is built in large part on our ability to sympathize with other people, right? And to put ourselves in another person's shoes. Now, sympathy and empathy are not the same thing. Everybody talks about developing empathy now, right? Like, well, do you know what empathy means?
I thought empathy was like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah,
And
like
sympathy is like just feeling sorry.
yeah, and I think that that's pretty close to the difference there, right? That empathy is feeling with someone, right? Feeling what they feel, whereas sympathy is feeling for someone, right? That is being able to imagine what they would feel in a particular situation, right? So sympathy is something that requires a bit more imagination than empathy does, right? In both cases, you're putting yourself, you're able to put yourself in someone else's place, right? But yeah, sympathy is feeling for rather than with. Yeah, you're right about that. So I think a lot of what Nussbaum is talking about here is that where education for profit fails in preparing us for democratic citizenship is that it fails to develop our sympathies, right? If all we're doing is narrowly focusing on how to perform a particular job function, right, then we're not really fully developing as human beings, much as these development indexes, right, only show how much money a country is making and not anything about how fairly that income is distributed or what system of government they have in that country or what overall quality of life is, right? So let's continue. Here, let's see, can I get somebody to read for us on page 50, starting the paragraph that starts with, in the context of the old paradigm of what it is for a nation to develop.
In the context of the old
Thank you.
paradigm, what it is for a nation to develop, what is our influence is the need for education to promote national development seen as economic growth. Such an education that has recently been outlined by the Smithsonian's Commissioner for the Use of Department of Education focusing on higher education. It is being implemented by many European nations as they give time limits to technical universities and university departments impose consistent
Draconian.
cuts on the humanities. It is central to discuss of education in this way as in most developing nations that are trying to drive a large share of the global market.
Okay, so does everybody know what draconian means, by the way? Okay, so draconian means extremely strict or severe, right? So draconian measures are severe measures. So the cuts she's saying are being imposed on humanities programs are severe cuts, right? Big cuts in budgets, big cuts in overall attention, right? Now, what do you think is the big idea she's trying to point out in this book? Do you notice any particular any pattern of language here that seems to relate to either the profit or democracy idea?
I think this goes with the profit of education.
Okay. Explain.
Because she kind of like outlines, like she says, such an education has recently been outlined by its own commission,
Okay.
by the U.S. Department of Education. And it's just focusing on higher education, it's not focusing on all of education.
Uh-huh.
So she's saying that they're basically just focusing on the profit of the higher education. It's
Okay.
not all.
So higher education here is universities, right? Colleges and universities. So yeah, this particular commission report was just focused on colleges and universities, and seems to want to encourage that activity in colleges and universities that seems to be most clearly connected to economic growth, right? And you know, if we think about it even in personal terms here, right? How many of you have had conversations with your parents where your parents have told you to major in something practical or something that's going to make you money? Okay, that's actually fewer of you than I expected. Usually, like the whole class, their hands shoot up, right? And you know what? You know, first off, let me say that I understand that perspective, right? Because college is expensive, right? And it's getting more expensive, and it's a bigger squeeze on your generation than it was on mine. For one thing, because we now basically require a bachelor's degree for any entry-level white-collar job. And also, just because the costs have exploded so enormously that, you know, loan debt is a much more significant problem for y'all than it was, say, for me or for my parents, right? So we're kind of pushing you into this situation where, you know, it's like people like me would love for you to be focused on your own personal growth and intellectual development, right? But the way the system is structured, you almost can't afford to be. Now, the one thing I think I've said this to a couple of you before, you know, when I heard a couple of you talking last time about thinking about changing your majors and things like that, right? By and large, unless you want a very, very specific job, right, it doesn't actually matter that much what you major in. You know, if you want to be an accountant, maybe you should major in accounting, right? But, you know, if we look at, you know, I'm not trying to knock on the pre-professional schools here, right? But if you look at what they do, most of them are just kind of applied versions of traditional arts and sciences disciplines, right? Accounting is applied math. Marketing is applied sociology. Advertising is applied psychology. You know, maybe both of those would also, you know, feature some stuff from English and history, right? Nursing is basically applied biology, with maybe a little bit of psychology mixed in there as well, right? So you're still getting a lot of the same base level material, right? Even if you're not in a pre-professional program. So, you know, this would just be, you know, my little piece of advice here is, you know, you're going to be here 4 to 6 years, right? Major in something because you like it, not because you think it's going to get you something at the end, because otherwise you're just going to make yourself miserable. And I think that, you know, one of the things that Nussbaum is trying to point out here is that liberal arts education does actually have particular benefits that might be missing from from technical education. Right? So if we look at the bottom of page 50 here, right? The United States has never had a pure growth-directed model of education. Some distinctive and by now traditional features of our system positively resist being cast in those terms. Unlike virtually every nation in the world, we have a liberal arts model of university education. Instead of entering college university to study a single subject, students are required to take a wide range of courses in their first 2 years, prominently including courses in the humanities. Right? This would not be the case if, like, you were going to college, say, somewhere in Europe. Then you would essentially be studying a single subject for 3 to 4 years. They don't do liberal arts education, although, to be fair, most of them also have better K-12 education systems than we do. So a lot of the material that y'all are getting in liberal arts classes in the US is stuff that somebody in, say, Belgium would have learned in high school. This model of university and college education influences secondary education. Nobody is tracked too early into a non-humanities stream, whether purely scientific or purely vocational, nor do children with a humanities focus lose all contact with the sciences at an early date. Nor is the emphasis on the liberal arts a vestige of elitism or class distinction. From early on, leading U.S. educators connected the liberal arts to the preparation of informed, independent, and sympathetic democratic citizens. The liberal arts model is still relatively strong, but is under severe stress now in this time of economic hardship. So, the word that I want to lay particular emphasis on here near the end of this paragraph is sympathetic, right? Sympathetic democratic citizens. So I think, Rendaria, you were talking a little bit about this in your free writing, right? About the need for respect for diversity of opinion and things like this, right? If you are living in a democracy in which people have differing opinions, what's the only way you can make it work?
The white bias.
Yeah, at the very least, you have to have respect for other people's positions, right? Even if you don't agree with them. And in order to have that kind of respect, right, you have to be able to see those other people as human beings, right? So this is where sympathy as a value is key to democracy. If you are having a disagreement with someone, right, it's harder to get angry with them and to hate them if you recognize common humanity with them, right? And this is one of the things that I find frankly terrifying about our current politics is our tendency to dehumanize each other and to demonize people who disagree with us, right? There are some political opinions out there that I will say are morally reprehensible, right? And that should not be entertained by anyone. But there's no way we make any progress, right, if we can't sit down and have a conversation as civilized human beings, right? And I think that's one of the big ideas that Nussbaum is grappling with here, or trying to get the reader to grapple with, right? Is that a purely technical education doesn't teach you this. A purely technical education teaches you to solve specific technical problems in exchange for goods and or services, right? It doesn't teach you to treat other people with respect, or to disagree cordially and effectively with others, right? So let's skip for a second to the end of the essay here, and this list of skills that she regards as crucial for developing here in a democracy, right? So can I get somebody to start reading this for us from the first bullet point, right? So the ability to think well about political issues.
The ability to think well about political issues affecting the nation to examine, reflect on unity, differing to them, neither tradition nor authority. The ability to recognize fellow citizens as people with equal rights, even though they may be different in race, religion, gender, and sexuality. To look at them with respect as ends, not just as tools to be manipulated for one's own profit. The ability to have concern for the lives of others, to grasp with policies, and many times need for the opportunities and experiences of one's own fellow citizens, and many times and for people outside one's own nation. Ability to imagine a variety of complex issues affecting the story of a human life as it unfolds. To think about childhood, adulthood, family, relationships, illness, death, and much more in a way informed by understanding of a wide range of human stories, not just by
Aggregates.
The ability to judge political leaders critically, but with an informed and realistic sense of the possibilities available to you. The ability to think about the good of the nation as a whole, not just of one's own political group. The ability to see one's own nation in turn as a part of a complicated world order in which issues of many kinds require intelligence, transnational deliberation, for the resolution.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. So, you remember, like, so when we talk about Confucius, right, there is one strand, right, one basic idea around which all of Confucius' ideas circle, right? The idea of reciprocity, that the way you treat others will come back to you, right? If we had to pull something like that out of this list of Nussbaums, I'm not saying there's just one thing. I think there are probably two, at least two, maybe three central ideas in this. What would you pull out of it?
Where it says the ability to imagine will a variety of complex issues, like, I guess that kind of leads back to the sympathy thing, like.
Okay. Yeah, the ability to imagine. Right now, can we see other bullet points here that relate to the ability to imagine? I think you're onto something. I think you're on the right track.
The ability to think well about political issues affecting the nation.
And yes, yeah.
The ability to recognize.
Yeah, the ability to think well about them. I think, like, if we go particularly to the end of that sentence, I think we see something related to imagination, right?
Yeah.
Deferring to neither tradition nor authority, right? So not just falling back on the old solution, right? But being able to think up new solutions. So yeah, that's related to imagination, right? What else do we see here that might be related to imagination?
The ability to see one's own nation in turn as part of the complicated world order and which issues of many kinds require national deliberation.
I think so. Yeah. So what's the logic there? How would that be related to imagination?
Like to see like your own nation as part of whatever it's saying, like you have to imagine that first.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, we have very little direct concept of the world outside of our immediate context, right? So, right, for us at this moment, right, this world is right here, right now, the place we're in, the people we're around. Anything beyond the confines of this space, right now, we kind of have to imagine. And if we want to think of ourselves as part of some kind of larger whole, that's something that requires a certain level of imagination, right? The idea of, for example, even like of a nation as a political entity, right, is basically imaginary. There's no natural reason why there should be a United States of America, right? It's something that is imagined into being by the citizens of that nation. Does this make sense? And if you can imagine yourself as a citizen of a nation, right, then you can also, by extension, imagine how your nation fits into that larger world order, right? Where, relationships with other nations, things like that. So we're about out of time, but I want you to keep thinking along these particular lines, right? Go back to this, look it over, and think about how all of this stuff is related to imagination, or the faculty of imagination, and how Nussbaum thinks a liberal arts education is particularly suited for getting us to imagine ourselves in this way, right? And so I remember